We have another gentleman in the room I'd like to put on the spot if I can, Mr. Craig George.
Craig.
Put on the spot.
Yeah. Look, you got the biggest name on here just about. And I know that we heard from you a little bit in your talk the other day, but it was more pretty focused, but wanted to give an opportunity to come up and maybe just talk about some of the same things that these gentlemen talked about in their early days, and some stories that you might have of coming up and learning and living and all that good stuff.
Am I supposed to go up there?
No, I hope
Yeah, you guys will be able to see you on camera.
What's that?
I'll be able to see you on camera, Jerry. Sat on the chair.
You said on top, it's gone.
Yeah, howdy.
There he is.
Those were wonderful presentations, very interesting. I have learned so much in the last 4 days about oral history that I frankly was unaware of. Yeah, it's a real honor to be part of this. I started in my first year was 1977, and I arrived the same month and probably almost the same day when the moratorium on bowhead whaling was imposed by the International Whaling Commission. And the town was in turmoil, to say the least. There were a lot of, I think, people in shock, very unhappy, very angry. But nonetheless, at NARL, there were a bunch of, the expediters and other people. I should say that I came up to take care of as an animal caretaker. So I was a logistics person, and we had, people may know what was called the animal colony there at the Arctic Research Facility, now called the ARF, which is still maintained by the Department of Wildlife Management. Nonetheless, there were 50 wolves, Irish the polar bear, there were 3 wolverines, there was Arctic fox, I don't know how many lemmings, snowy owl, etc. But I was one of the logistic people, and I worked very closely with Frankie Ockpick. Harry Brower Sr. helped us build cages, all the people at the welding shop, and a bunch of folks like Benny Nagiak and Roy. And we had our own hut, which has now since been condemned and buried somewhere. But that's where we congregated every night. And I shouldn't mention this, but I think at the PX store, beer was $5 a case. So there was some beer involved back then. But that was my initiation. And then I started hearing stories about the importance of bowhead whale hunting. And I frankly didn't know what a bowhead was at the time. But that was the big research emphasis. And NARL, a couple years later, was shut down. The ONR funding ended. And it essentially went into cold storage. But Tom Albert and Ray Dronenberg were encouraged by Jake Adams and others, Eugene Brower, to help with the problem of estimating bowhead whale abundance. So, and I was a practical sort of less than average intelligence, but anyway, I was pretty handy at the time, and I was a mountaineer. I liked, spending time out in cold, nasty conditions. And actually, one of the reasons I came to Alaska, agreed to take the job, was to get poised to climb Denali, which I did in '78, and quickly realized it's pretty serious climbing up here. and maybe I had there wasn't a great future in mountaineering in Alaska is extremely dangerous. But so I kind of transferred those skills to learning how to work on the sea ice. And Tom, to his credit, recognized this kind of unusual character, myself, that might be useful in doing Arctic research. And I got to say that I had a degree in wildlife biology from Utah State, terrestrial biology, wildlife biology, but working with Tom, Eric Fullman, Mark Chappell, some of the Underwood, Larry Underwood, and Dave Norton, the list goes on. Those were the resident people at the time, and I got fascinated with Arctic biology and cold weather physiology and that sort of thing. I thought, wow, this is really interesting. And then, as I said, research funding for the bowhead whale research appeared, and a very unusual thing happened. The federal government, after imposing the moratorium based on, let's say, less than adequate, they were trying, but the estimates weren't particularly good. And they were quite low compared to the actual abundance of bowheads at the time, but you know, they were trying, but the point was that, kind of lost my point here, but we were trying to do that work properly, and we got a lot of local input. Tom Albert and Harry Brower struck up a friendship. Oh, I say the unusual thing that happened is the federal government said, fine, you do it. And it was like, I think I use the analogy, it's a poor analogy, but you know, when you're 16, your dad handing you the keys to the car, it's like, and it was a very daunting task and a very important one. And then Tom said, well, if you want to work on bowheads, you have to live here. And I thought, wow, this is fantastic. An opportunity to live in the Arctic year round and work with all the fantastic people. You know, it's interesting. Kenneth, I've heard over and over, Kenneth Tuwak was really instrumental in so much of, you know, we were already, you know, 100 feet from the summit when we started our work, based on all the great folks that came before us. But nonetheless, we utilized local knowledge, and that's to help us site our camps, you know, work safely on the ice. We learned about migration timing, this remarkable ability of bowheads to navigate under completely closed leads. You know, the researchers had some evidence of that. If anybody's been on the ice in the spring when the lead closes, you could hear blows out there. So it's like, well, maybe there are a few whales going by, but in fact, we then worked with some acoustics experts, including Chris Clark and Bill Ellison. And Bill Ellison was a Navy sub chaser, knew a lot about it. He said, if they're making noise out there, we can find them. And bowheads happen to be very vocal, so they were, bowheads like to talk a lot, so that was a very useful trait in locating them. And sure enough, in these periods where the lead was closed, you could have massive migrations of whales. And we were able to document that. And what that allowed us to do is during periods when the visual count would be shut down, we could interpolate between days. I won't go into the statistics, but basically that, and the fact that many were beyond what we could see with binoculars, it was still basically a visual count with an acoustic correction. That's the way it was designed at the time. But the estimates basically doubled, and eventually it was 1982 or 3 when the IWC finally said, we recommend a quota with caution. No quota number, but they finally, after recommending zero quota year after year, 78, 79, 80, 81, 82, I think we had a pretty good count that year. And the acoustic work actually started a little later, but then by 1985, when the work was fully integrated into the bowhead count, I'm sorry if I'm being too detailed here, but the quota for the local harvest was set at reasonable levels and then increased to over the next decade or so, 2 decades to the current level of I think 56 landed a year is the current limit, or 67 strikes. And then after 10 years of counting, we were able to show an increasing trend, and again verified more traditional knowledge that, like the old timers like Harry and Kenneth and others, and elders from St. Lawrence Island in particular, said, boy, there are a lot more bowheads than when we were young men. We'd sit out there all day in the Umiak and see one blow. And now, you know, anybody who's been on the ice in spring knows there's quite a few more bowheads. So that was my sort of history, and it was interesting. Tom Opie was just recognized for setting up. He was out here at Tuckalikstad, was with the fire department here, and he moved into a village, married Margaret Levitt Opie, wonderful lady, but and set up the fire department across the North Slope. And somebody, you know, he was given recognition at the Gnarl 50th, and he said something that I've always said. People said, "Well, thanks for the great work," and he said it was fun. And yeah, I mean, I consider it a great honor to have been able to been involved in the work, but I have to say it was just so exciting, so fun. And I can't encourage the next generation enough to come live in the community, raise their kids here, like Max Brewer and others did, Tom Albert. If you talk to Tom Albert's kids, they'll say that some of the best years of their life was running around Gnarl. There was a bunch of kids, and one of our recommendations was family-friendly housing for research. But they, this is kind of pre-OSHA days, but all the kids had three-wheelers.
Yes.
And there was these little three-wheeler / motorcycle gangs cruising around Gnarl out to the point. Anyway, it's really been a great experience, and I have a much better appreciation now of how, like I said, we started halfway up the mountain. People you heard talk today and others had done so much to bring the community into the science, support and advice. A lot of the best ideas that we had on our bowhead research came from local people. I mentioned that, you know, olfaction and being able to smell an air that for bowheads, that was a local idea that was a textbook changer when we, I mean, in the textbooks, it said emphatically, cetaceans are incapable of smelling an air. They might have, and turned that on its head, and many other things. We stumbled into discovering the longest lived mammal on Earth. Again, that was serendipity, working in the community, and just, I can't tell you how much time I spent at Harry Sr.'s house going over for coffee. He would drop it. He was always doing a carving. He'd set it down, and very patiently, talk about ice safety, talk about, running dogs, you name it, any question. And that, and many of the others, Kenneth, Luther Levitt, on and on and on. So, Hoyanukpa, thanks for a chance to say a few words.